The room was already too quiet when I entered, but somehow it got quieter when the glass door clicked shut behind me. 8 chairs, 7 faces. None of them lifted to greet me. The only thing moving was the screen behind the new VP, Reese Everin, a man I'd barely met now, standing where vision should have lived. On that screen, Project Sable pulsed. The soft blue glow of the UI I'd designed, lines of my code breathing in real time. She looked perfect, and she was already speaking. Anticipated redundancy. 1 FTE lead systems architect. That was me. That was it. No introduction, no meeting agenda, no explanation, just a digitized voice announcing the end of my tenure like a weather update. Reese didn't blink. Neither did the others. I scanned their faces, finance, compliance, legal, and that new strategy hire with the gold tie and empty eyes. Not one of them looked sorry. They looked prepared. I didn't sit. No one offered a chair. I stood still, hands at my sides, fighting to keep my breath inside my chest. It wasn't even anger yet. It was something worse. Stillness. Sable kept going. Projected cost savings, $3.8 million, effective date immediate. No pink slip, no exit interview, no handshake or forced smile. I had built her voice. I had tuned it to sound calm, neutral, reassuring even, and now it was being used to narrate my own deletion. I felt like I was floating above myself, watching the scene from a surveillance feed. Reese spoke finally. You'll be given an opportunity to transition into a non-operational advisory role. Remote. No need to attend further strategy calls. You'll retain legacy access credentials for now. Legacy. Like a statue. Or a software patch someone forgets to uninstall. I nodded once because words were brittle, and I didn't trust mine not to shatter. He nodded back like we'd concluded a casual update, then turned to his tablet. I walked out without another glance. My heels echoed in the hallway, the only sound I seemed to make anymore. I didn't go straight to my car. I drifted. Past the lobby, past the elevator, into the long corridor that used to lead to my lab, and I realized I hadn't lost my job. I'd been overwritten. By the time I reached my desk, the cursor no longer blinked. I came in the next morning out of muscle memory more than intent. The elevator still recognized my badge. The security guard nodded, like nothing had changed. But everything had. The walk to my desk felt longer, even though the floor layout hadn't shifted. When I arrived, my terminal blinked awake, but my login returned a limited access prompt. No warning, no explanation, just a stripped-down dashboard like the skeleton of something I once knew intimately. No real-time data, no system logs, no server interactions, just sanitized widgets and high-level charts anyone with a browser could view. The workspace I had shaped for years now stared back like a room someone else lived in. I opened the terminal and typed 3 commands in quick succession. One blinked red. The others returned access denied. I tried my system key admin, then double-checked for typos, even though I'd typed that line 1,000 times before. Still denied. No override. No fallback. Not even an error message with a contact. My hands stayed on the keyboard for a few seconds longer, unwilling to accept what the screen had already told me. Then I let them fall to my lap. Around me, the office buzzed in muted rhythm. Conversations flowed, monitors flickered, laughter rose in low bursts from the far row where integration usually sat. No one looked up when I walked past. No one paused like they used to. I wasn't invisible. I was just omitted. Even Adric, the intern I trained through 2 summer cycles who used to linger near my desk with endless questions, walked right by without a glance. It wasn't hostility. It was absence. At 10:40, I went to the break room. The coffee was burned and bitter, but I poured a cup anyway. I reached for a napkin, and that's when I saw it folded small and wedged between the dispenser and the wall. A note, printed in square, blocky handwriting. You built the core, not them. Just know you're not crazy. No signature, no initials, just ink and quiet validation. I slipped it into my pocket like it might vanish if I didn't keep it close. I didn't know who left it. but I knew exactly what I needed to find. I hadn't touched the rusted metal box under my bed in over a year. It lived beside forgotten printer ink and an old flash drive with a cracked cap. The lid stuck when I tried to open it, the hinge complaining like it had its own opinion of being summoned. Inside were receipts, legal envelopes, and half-filled notebooks stained with coffee rings. I shuffled through the mess, slowly half believing this was just nostalgia disguised as action. Then I saw it, cream-colored paper, thick, sharp-edged, and stamped. 5 pages, signed, notarized. I sat down on the floor, cross-legged the box at my side, and my heart crawling into my throat. It was the original licensing agreement from when I'd first proposed Project Sable, not to Dynex, but to myself. Back when I ran prototypes off my own servers on my own time, because the board hadn't believed in scalable ethical AI yet. Clause 9.3b. I read it 3 times. Ownership of all unmodified core logic, including behavioral matrices, ethical sequence modules, and adaptive decision roots, remains the sole property of Vance Systems, LLC. I exhaled so slowly, it almost felt like forgetting how to breathe. Dynex had integrated the system. They'd layered dashboards, renamed modules, redesigned the interface, but they hadn't changed the core. I would have known. I wrote the DNA. Every pulse, every limb, every boundary, and by their own legal agreement, if they didn't materially alter that core, they didn't own it. I sat back the document, trembling slightly in my hands, not from adrenaline, from clarity. They thought they'd buried me under titles and access restrictions, but they were standing on something they never built. I pulled my laptop closer and began matching the lines of code I'd stored in backups to the public-facing documentation Dynex had released to investors. Their white papers mentioned enhancements, refinements, expansions. But not once did they cite a structural change to the decision matrices. They hadn't rewritten me out. They just painted over the foundation and hoped I wouldn't notice, and they'd forgotten who poured the concrete. I booted up my personal rig, the one I hadn't touched since before the merger talks. No cloud syncing, no company overlays, just a machine that still trusted me. Buried in the archive was the early scaffold of Sable when she didn't even have a name yet. Just logic trees and learning loops nested like origami. I traced the code slowly, following the neural map line by line until I hit a node I'd almost forgotten I created. Root auth LV1. It blinked at me. Still active, still clean, still mine. I had written it in the early hours one winter after reviewing a white paper on internal sabotage in autonomous systems. A silent guardian, what I called a parent lock. Not part of the core function, not visible in front-end builds, just there, waiting, buried beyond the reach of standard admin credentials, uncopyable, unforkable, bound to a biometric trigger only I possessed. It was my failsafe. Dynex had stripped me from every panel, revoked every key. But they never knew this existed because I never told them. They hadn't removed it. They hadn't even looked for it. They assumed visibility meant ownership. They assumed silence meant surrender. They were wrong on both counts. I leaned back, pulse steady, almost serene. This wasn't a backdoor or a trap. It was architecture, meant not to destroy but to protect. A final clause in code written by someone who didn't trust the future to stay ethical without a spine. I placed my fingertips on the sensor embedded in the side of the machine. A soft green pulse blinked, once then cleared. The node responded instantly, unfurling a diagnostic string that mapped the system's current state. Dynex had built their empire on top of my foundation, and now I held the last remaining thread that kept it from splitting at the seams. The next step wasn't about revenge, it was about control. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to. Clarity has a way of keeping the body alert, even in stillness. Just after 3 a.m., I opened a secure browser and found an old contact buried in a forgotten thread, Cale Sorrell, now CEO of Valeris Logic. We had written code side by side once back when theory still felt like a revolution waiting to happen. He'd believed in balance then in systems that didn't just function, but functioned with integrity. I remembered that. I was counting on it. I sent one line. Still believe systems need conscience. I have something you'll want to see. EV17. Minutes later, my screen blinked to life. Encrypted call. No greeting. Just his familiar voice, quiet and careful. Talk. I did. I showed him the root lock, the untouched clause, the skeleton they had built their empire on, the ethics engine they dismantled for speed, and the interface they polished over code they never understood. Cale didn't interrupt, didn't look away. When I finished, he leaned in and said, "What do you want?" $1, I said. He raised an eyebrow. And full deployment control. I don't want advisory status. I don't want a committee. I want to lead it, start to finish. No investors in the room. No branding team breathing down my neck. He was quiet for a beat longer than I expected. Then we'll sign tonight. We did. Digitally. Time-stamped. Secured across 3 redundant nodes. No legal fanfare. No announcement. Just clean code, clean terms, and the digital transfer of one symbolic dollar. It wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the condition. I wasn't handing them a product. I was giving them a foundation. With one rule, I decide what it becomes. Not for glory, not even for vindication, but because this time no one else would rewrite my name out of the system I built. By dawn, I had already renamed the first module. I turned the spare bedroom into a war room, not with weapons, but with principles. Coffee mugs lined the windowsill, ringed with dried intentions. Cables tangled like quiet veins. My old monitor flickered softly in the corner, untouched by corporate branding, untouched by compromise. I named her Era. She wasn't a reboot. She was a resurrection. I started with the fairness buffer, the piece Dynex stripped for streamlining. Then came the contextual weighting system, the part that could distinguish between a mistake and a pattern. I reactivated the bias filters they had once labeled as performance draining. And then finally the escalation tree, the logic branch that stopped the system before it flagged a human being as expendable. That one took the longest. Cale never rushed me, not once. He sent resources engineers, even offered his lead product manager. I said no. This part needed my hands, not because I didn't trust his team, but because I needed Era to remember where she came from, to know that her bones weren't hollow, that she was built with spine. We didn't announce anything. There were no teaser logos or cryptic website countdowns. We let the silence do the talking. Kyle understood that. Let it breathe, he'd said. Let them forget we're here until it's too late. At night, I ran simulations. At dawn, I rewrote trees that could hold both efficiency and empathy without collapsing. During the day, I ate in silence and coded like I was trying to outrun something. Maybe I was. Era wasn't louder. She didn't shout with performance graphs or flash her superiority in benchmark metrics. But she learned nuance faster than Sable ever did. She paused when other systems lunged. She weighed before she flagged. And when I asked her if a false positive was worth a ruined life, she didn't respond with numbers. She asked for context. That's how I knew she was ready to see daylight again. 3 weeks after I renamed the final ethics module, Cale forwarded a short internal email. Kingmere Holdings has withdrawn from all contracts. Effective immediately. No explanation, no press release. Just silence and the quiet removal of a logo from Dynex's partner page. I didn't respond right away. I simply opened my own logs. Era had completed her latest integrity simulation overnight. All green. No false flags. No deviation from ethical constraints. Response time within acceptable range, but not optimized for speed. That was intentional. I was building pause into the machine, a moment of consideration before judgment. By the time I finished reviewing the logs, 2 more clients had walked away from Dynex. Smaller accounts, 1 logistics, 1 biotech, but enough to rattle any investor watching from the sidelines. Again, no official statements, just clean exits. Kale messaged. You think they know what's happening? I typed back, not yet. But they're starting to feel it. We hadn't launched anything publicly. No demos, no leaks, not even a whisper on the back-end forums. But Era had already reached a few hands in private pilot programs, quiet NDAs, small-scale tests, just enough to let her speak for herself. She wasn't perfect, but she listened. When one of the testers submitted a conflicting query about resource allocation and demographic bias, Ira paused, flagged it, and requested clarification rather than forcing a binary resolution. That moment, that pause. That's what changed everything. It wasn't the outcomes. It was the space in between. The space Dynex had deleted in their rush to automate decision-making into oblivion. I watched the analytics quietly pile up. Clean outputs, consistent results, systems that didn't crash under gray area pressure, no catastrophic failures, no hard denials wrapped in algorithmic indifference. Meanwhile, Dynex remained loud conferences, panels, funding announcements, but something in their core had already cracked. Not publicly, not yet. But the first fracture never sounds like thunder. It sounds like nothing at all. And still, I said nothing. Because I knew exactly who was going to notice first. I found out through a message from Kyle. No subject, just a link. TechWire exclusive. The woman behind the algorithm, Dynex silenced. I clicked. There it was, my name in the headline, my code in the screenshots, my words pulled from archived developer notes I hadn't read in years. They didn't bury the lead. Clause 9.3b was printed in full annotated highlighted. So was the diagram of the parent lock, my initials still embedded in the authentication string. The article traced everything: the licensing agreement, the quiet removal of my admin, access, the ethics modules. Dynex stripped the fracture at Kingmere. But it wasn't the legal detail that landed hardest. It was the phrasing. They erased her name from the interface, but not from the architecture. I read that line twice. The article spread fast. By noon, I had unread messages from former teammates, from silent peers I hadn't spoken to since the restructure, and even from 2 VCs who'd once dismissed ethical AI as a nice-to-have. They weren't reaching out in sympathy. They were reaching out in alarm. The story had gone viral for a reason. It wasn't just technical. It was human. And people had started to realize that what Dynex had erased wasn't just a woman. It was a warning. By 3 p.m., a formal email landed in my inbox. Subject: request for strategic dialogue. Tone polished, rehearsed. It mentioned mutual interest, collaborative clarity, and shared vision. It didn't mention my name until the final line. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to Kyle with a single word: no. That evening, I watched a clip of a Dynex press conference. Their CEO, flanked by PR handlers, offered something that sounded like reassurance and ended with a deflection about innovation cycles. He never looked directly at the camera. He never said my name. He didn't need to, because now for the first time in months, everyone else was saying it for him. The call came just after sunrise. I didn't answer. I was already awake, sitting at my desk with Era's overnight logs pulled up, each one clean, each decision traceable. A pause in a fraud escalation where there should have been a hard flag. A recommendation for human review where most systems would have automated termination. She was learning restraint. She was learning to ask why. At 6:42 a.m., Kale forwarded a video link from Dynex's internal feed, leaked by someone who hadn't yet decided which way the tide was turning. It showed a screen recording of their main admin interface. Blinking red, unresponsive nodes, commands typed furiously, each one ending in the same return, error 403. Creator authentication required. The parent lock had activated. I watched the sequence, calmly noting the frantic escalation. 6 markets frozen, user dashboards grayed out, logs inaccessible, decision trees inert. Their flagship AI product, the same one they'd called a market revolution, had stopped moving, not crashed, not compromised, just refusing to continue. Because the system they'd branded and rebranded, layered and monetized had finally reached the boundary I built into it, the ethical perimeter. The moment it could no longer reconcile its directives with its origin. They couldn't override it. They couldn't even explain it. Only I could, but I didn't. The messages came quickly, first from internal staff, then from a Dynex board contact I hadn't spoken to since they stripped me from the design notes. The final message was from their CTO. It offered compensation renewed partnership and a role on a newly formed task force for system integrity. I didn't decline. I didn't reply. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and walked out onto my balcony. The morning air felt still thick, with the kind of silence that only means something broke. Behind closed doors, they were scrambling to reboot a machine that no longer trusted them. One they thought they controlled, one they thought they'd written over, but they hadn't, because I never gave them the key. It was raining the morning I stepped into Valeris HQ. Not the cinematic kind, just a steady, quiet drizzle that blurred the city without drama. The kind of rain that doesn't demand an umbrella, just patience. The building didn't announce itself. No banners, no logos screaming innovation, just glass clear, uninterrupted, wrapped around a structure that breathed intention. Inside, I walked past a frosted panel set just off the main corridor. It caught the corner of my eye before I registered it fully. Simple font, no border. Allowen Vance, Director of Human-Centered Intelligence. No title inflation, no corporate poetry. Just truth. I stood there for a second longer than I meant to tracing the clean lines of my name. It wasn't bold. It didn't need to be. It was present. And that was enough. We had renamed the system Solara. Kyle had chosen the word Latin loosely translated of the sun. I liked that. Not because it promised power, but because it promised light. Solara didn't launch with a gala or media push. We released it with intention direct to the sectors that had been hurt most by careless automation community clinics, legal aid systems, public education platforms. Places where misclassification wasn't just an error, it was a consequence. We built in ethical tracebacks, delay functions for edge case ambiguity, language that didn't default to punishment. We gave users a button that said, "I need context," and built logic to honor it. Every time Solara ran clean, I heard it like a heartbeat. Every time it paused instead of acting prematurely, I saw a shadow of who I used to be, sleep-deprived and unseen, finally finding shape. Kale never asked for weekly demos. He trusted the process. And more importantly, he trusted the architect. Dynex spiraled in press cycles for weeks. Access denied. Governance failures. The absence of guardrails they didn't know they needed. But I didn't read every headline. I didn't need to. I spent my time walking our floor, answering engineers' questions, revising with them, building forward. Never above them. Always beside. Sometimes late at night, I'd stand in the atrium alone, hand brushing the edge of the glass where my name now lived. Not lit up, not framed, just quietly holding its place like the code I'd buried long before anyone knew to look for it.